The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the Pearson Common Core Institute. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Molly Spalding, and I'm joined with my colleague, Nicole Kohlbecker, and we are curriculum specialists with Pearson. It is our privilege to serve as your moderators this afternoon. Pearson recognizes that the Common Core is more than just a new set of standards to be mapped to your old curriculum. It's about new ways of teaching, instilling higher order thinking skills, and preparing students for the challenges of college and career. The fall series of the Pearson Common Core Institute is designed to provide practical guidance on how to implement the Common Core. While this series focuses on the Common Core, it is part of our ongoing Pearson Institute series. Please watch for upcoming webinars that will focus on changes and trends in education and how they impact you. All participants will receive an email within 1 week of today's presentation with a link to the recorded version of this webinar. The link will also include a certificate of participation and a copy of the presentation slides as an attachment. So be on the lookout for that email in the next few days. Before we begin today's webinar, I'd like to go through some brief technical housekeeping tips. You can choose to receive the audio portion of the webinar through your computer speakers or through the telephone by clicking on one of these options in your control panel. Due to the large number of participants today, all lines have been automatically muted. To participate in the question and answer portion of today's webinar, please type your question into the question log on your control panel and click Send. Please feel free to type in questions at any time, and we will then relay these to our speaker to answer at the end of the presentation. A few other toolbar options in your control panel. Clicking on the white arrow in the orange box at the top of the control panel will minimize the GoToWebinar control panel, and clicking on the arrow again will maximize the control panel so that you can type into the question log. You can view the presentation in full screen mode by clicking on the white rectangle inside the blue circle. And then that last blue circle with the hand and the green arrow inside is the Raise Your Hand button. And just to make sure everyone can hear me loud and clear, can you go ahead and click on that Raise Your Hand button now? All right, I'm seeing a bunch of hands go up in the air, so it looks like we're coming through loud and clear. Thank you very much. And we certainly hope that this does not depict any of our participants today, but if you experience technical difficulties and require assistance, you can call the GoToMeeting customer support line for assistance at 888-259-8414 and select option 1. You can join with other educators to continue today's discussion even after the webinar is over, share your thoughts, your questions, and log into your Twitter account and perform a search for hashtag CCSSVCon2012 and save the search. From here, you can tweet your thoughts and impressions of today's event. And before I introduce our speaker today, we'd like to get to know our audience a little bit more, so I'm going to go ahead and launch 2 interactive polls. The first poll is being launched on your screen right now. If you could please select which grade levels you primarily work with, and you're able to select more than one if you cross several different grade bands there. We'll just give it a few more seconds to let the rest of the audience select the grade bands they work with. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So we can see 21% of our audience works in the pre-K through 5 grade level, 35% is with 6th through 8th grade, and 45% is 9 through 12. All right, and we have a second poll related to Common Core and where you are in the implementation process for Common Core. Have you not yet begun implementing? Perhaps administrators are going through training, teachers are going through training. You're going to adapt your current student materials to meet the Common Core state standards, or maybe you're researching new Common Core state standard compliant student materials. Again, feel free to click on all that apply. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close out our poll and share the results. So 13% have not yet begun implementing, 22% are with administrator training, 67% teacher training, 65% are planning to adapt current student materials, and 53% are researching new Common Core compliant student materials. Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing our poll and letting us get to know you a little bit more. And now it is my honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Freddy Hiebert. Dr. Hiebert is President and CEO of Text Project, Inc., a not-for-profit aimed at increasing student reading levels through appropriate text. She is also a research associate at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Dr. Hiebert's research has been published in numerous scholarly journals, and she has authored or edited 9 books. Dr. Hiebert's model of accessible text for beginning and struggling readers has been used to develop several reading programs, including Pearson's Quick Reads and Q Reads, and these are widely used in schools today. Freddy chaired a group of experts on early childhood literacy who served in an advisory capacity to the Common Core State Standard writers, and Dr. Hiebert currently serves on the IRA Committee on the Common Core State Standards. And at this time, I am going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Dr. Freddy Hiebert.
Thanks so much, Molly. I hope that we've got that now. Okay. Well, welcome to all of you, and thank you very, very much for your interest and commitment to American students and their best possible learning. By this point, it's no surprise that what is the most unique aspect of the Common Core State Standards is the fact that we're also attending not just to the kinds of strategies or processes students use, but also to the levels of the text, and that's Standard 10. So no longer, as in previous standards documents, are we talking about students being able to do certain things proficiently with grade level text. We've actually given some very concrete ideas in the Common Core State Standards about what grade level text is. Now, my focus today is really going to be on things that you can do in your classrooms to support the goal of increased reading of complex text. But to give you just a little bit of background, I'm going to talk about why this emphasis on text complexity within the Common Core, and talk not as definitively as I'd like to about what it is that makes a text complex. I'm going to remind you when we're talking about this topic of complex text that when any issue is complex, typically the answers aren't simple, and the conversation about these topics, you can find resources in numerous places on my website, and I'll give you that at the end of the presentation. But I want to emphasize today that while I'm really going to talk about how you can support students right now with the text you have, I want to give you just a little overview about why text complexity and what it is that makes a text complex. So the really fundamental issue, there are really 2 reasons why this emphasis right now, but the most central one, of course, is the information explosion. And this is a slide that we made a couple months ago, which is probably obsolete now, but illustrates the amount of information available on the internet in these three years. And as I said, I'm positive it's obsolete by now. But the point is that the 21st century is a time of information. The haves are the ones who have knowledge and also who have ways of gaining new knowledge. And while you can learn things through YouTube, at least particular things, sometimes you might not want students to learn too much of those things, but the primary way in which we keep our knowledge is in text. And this slide tells us something about the differences per 1,000 words for the appearance of rare words. So what this is actually saying is that in children's books, and this is really intended to be like picture books, Caldecott kinds of award winners, we actually see 40% more rare words in text than in adult college individuals speaking to one another. Now, I want to point out that even though we have things like Discover Channel and many, many different kinds of programs you can use on watch on the History Channel, the point is that most of that media, most of the videotapes, most of the movies actually started out as written in a written form. So text really, really matters. The point is that in the 21st century, knowledge is the key, and to access knowledge, you have to be able to read proficiently, you also have to be able to read critically, and you have to be able to read across text. Now, I was glad to see that we have a very large contingent of high school and middle school folks on the webinar today, because the second big reason for the Common Core was a report called Reading Between the Lines that showed that about 51% of students were prepared for college. And in fact, across the high school years, they appeared to get decreasingly more, less prepared for college. So we've heard descriptions that texts have been dumbed down, and this is something that I've spent a lot of time working on. I want you to look at the bottom line, and actually in that red circle, a report that looked at college tests, tasks in community colleges and universities, as well as in the military and citizenship, found that the texts were actually quite discrepant between high school, the end of high school, and college in the workplace. And that's really the initiative or the incentive for this effort. Now, if you look at those lines, if you look at the yellow line, you'll see that there are some very concrete recommendations in the Common Core about the kinds of quantitative levels students should be at. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on that today. That's something that you can find lots of information about, as I said, on my website, Text Project. The point is that when we reviewed the research, what we find is that indeed the place where there's been a plateau, a leveling off in terms of text complexity is not in the primary grades, but it's something that really starts in the middle grades, middle school, and really comes to fruition in high school. So there are some of us who work in early childhood settings who've been really asking whether there is such a need, as does happen in the Common Core, to accelerate levels at the primary levels. That's a pretty legitimate question. But the bottom line is that students in middle schools and in high schools typically aren't reading as much as they need to reach the levels that they need, nor are they always reading the levels of text that they need to be reading. So that gives you some background. This really is an initiative about increasing capacity as you move through the middle grades of the elementary school, middle school, and high school. Now, what exactly is a complex text? And the more I work on this, I think the more I'm perplexed and the more complex the question is. But I do want you to realize that for someone who can't read very well, most texts are complex. And you can have very simple texts. And here I took 5 very, very profound statements in English literature. I found their lexile levels, which is something that's given in the Common Core Appendix A recommendations, and these would all fall into the kindergarten grade 1 span. And yet we see that even though the words are simple, to be or not to be, that is the question, or I think, therefore I am, these are you can have very profound statements with very simple language. So I want to really be clear that answers to text complexity aren't simple ones. And just because the words are harder or the sentences are longer doesn't mean that the ideas are completely comprehensible. From the people who wrote the Common Core, they really emphasize that complex texts have texts that have a lot going on. They also talk about the demandingness of the vocabulary. As we saw in these examples, you can have vocabulary that isn't terribly demanding that can also call out very, very profound thoughts. But typically, vocabulary and the ideas in the text, because remember, words, vocabulary, represent ideas. So when we bring in new ideas or new versions of known ideas, when we elaborate on ideas, it's through the vocabulary. The Common Core gave us some recommendations about looking at different dimensions. Again, this is not something I'm going to focus on today. You can access some other webinars where we've talked about it. But the point that I want to make is that there need to be multiple ways of looking at text. And I really want to emphasize that for teachers thinking about this, particularly if you're a content area teacher, that complexity, a first wave or a first take on complexity, really can be through the vocabulary. Vocabulary is often a forecaster of text complexity. Now, I don't want to claim here that syntax doesn't matter. When you begin to embed more and more clauses in sentences, text gets harder. But it's the vocabulary that's really the first wave of a topic that if students don't have vocabulary in science, mathematics, social studies, so on, literature, when you read a book like a Jane Austen book, if you don't have some of the higher level literary vocabulary, you really have a difficult time accessing the text. Furthermore, as teachers, syntax is something that can be developed through writing activities, but it's much, much more difficult to develop it as a separate activity in reading. So for today's discussion, I'm going to suggest that this can be a forecaster. Complex texts have complex ideas, and vocabulary is an index of that. So I've given you a very brief, very quick overview of why this emphasis and what we mean by complex text. And now I want to get into some actions for what you can do, especially with the text that you have. I really began thinking about this because a teacher on a webinar that I gave about a year ago, and I never got that teacher's name, basically said, some of these ideas you're talking about are really great, but as a classroom teacher, I have particular texts that I need to deal with. And what I'm going to suggest is that there is an immense amount that we can do as classroom teachers during this academic year to both increase students' interest in text, their learning from text, and also their involvement. I know that there's a lot of concern and worrying. My state, I live in California, is part of the Smarter Balanced Consortium. There are two main organizations, PARC and Smarter Balanced, that are devising tests. And on Tuesday, Smarter Balanced offered some of their sample items. And I have to say I'm very, very sanguine. They're actually much more relieved and less worried than I've been because the passages are very acceptable, doable passages for different grade levels. And one of the things that you need to keep remembering is that when we do assessments, typically students aren't asked, they can't be asked to read full-length books. So a lot of what we're needing to do is get our kids onto the page more frequently and get them to think about what they're reading. So I'm going to give you 7 specific actions that you can take through the course of this school year. And I've actually written a little article that I'll reference at the end that you can take a look at. I'm going to suggest that as classroom teachers, we really need to stop thinking just about content coverage or about getting through material. And we really need to be thinking about what it is our students are learning. And I want to, again, return to that point that I made earlier, that there are particular funds of information, funds of knowledge, that only happen in school settings. You could sit through numerous nighttime television shows. You could sit through numerous conversations in coffee shops, and it would be rare that you would hear some terms like photosynthesis. Perhaps at this time in that we're getting ready for an election, you might hear about representational forms of government, but probably not in those terms. There's certain knowledge that's from the domain of schools. Now, if there are lots of high school and middle school people here, when it comes to informational text, and the Common Core has made a real emphasis on informational text, obviously because we're in an information age. But when we look at informational text, we're pretty clear about what it is that needs to be taught through those texts. In fact, if we're in a content area, we've usually got curriculum maps or guides in particular kinds of vocabulary that's been called out. I'm going to talk a little bit more in just a bit for the second point about how we need to connect that knowledge. But today, I want to really emphasize that for those of you who are English language arts teachers and who have been hearing about the emphasis or the percentages distributions of informational text on the Common Core, I also want to underscore that no one is dismissing good literature, good stories, good narratives. One of the things about narratives that the Common Core is emphasizing, though, is the kind of stance that you take to the narrative. Frequently, when we've taken books like The Birch Bark House or M.C. Higgins, in teaching literature, there's been an enormous amount of personal response. Have you ever been in situations like MC? Or have you ever been in a situation like the protagonist in Birch Bark Tree? I've actually written a short article that is connected to this presentation that you can find on the web. It's not just informational text that supports knowledge acquisition. The problem is that with information, with stories, with narrative text, we've often been rudderless. As teachers, we've often not known how the information in those texts needs to be connected to topics, to broader topics than just the topic in the text. We haven't had a good sense of curriculum. And as this slide shows, if you look at the words called out in previous standards documents for content areas like civics, mathematics, and science, you've got a really good idea here of what it is that the texts are going to talk about, what the central ideas are going to be. So if you see a text that has to do with inherited characteristics or a text about water capacity, you know about other vocabulary terms that are going to be connected. But in the case of English language arts, these are the terms that were found in previous standards documents, and this particular standards document is not any different in terms of calling out what the big themes of literature are. Okay, so I find it difficult to think of very many really compelling stories that I've read lately that have abbreviation as a central component or paragraph as a protagonist. the terms that we've always focused on in English language arts are processes. They're talking about the text and around the features of the text. They aren't talking about the content. What is it about human nature? What is it about how people solve problems that really needs to be emphasized in this text? So the first action has to do with a consciousness of the knowledge that we are communicating through the activities, the lessons, and the text students are reading. And here's an example of what I'm suggesting as knowledge maps, where we need to support students in seeing how a theme about communities is developed by different narrative writers. As I said, I think we have a pretty good idea about how to do that with informational texts and in content areas. But often, we've been emphasizing personal response at the expense of looking at the very profound ways in which authors of different periods and different perspectives have us come to understand the human experience. Stories are where we tell every generation, every culture tells things about how they're approaching the human condition. And what I'm suggesting is knowledge maps where students have a consciousness of what it is that they're learning are critical. In fact, I would love to see in the next decade a common practice being journals that kids keep over school years that really allow them to focus in on what it is that they know, what's critical for them, and what they've found out through reading, through watching different media, and through integrating that knowledge. So that comes to the second point, the second action that teachers can take. Now, I've been talking already with these knowledge maps about connecting the knowledge that's being developed in your curriculum. But I'm also going to suggest that there needs to be some connection to students' existing knowledge, to the overall purposes of the text, and, as I've already talked, across texts and experiences. Now, there are lots and lots of interpretations of the Common Core that you're going to hear that are already floating around. It's almost like a giant rumor mill. And some of them have to do with not privileging existing knowledge or not spending much time on prior reading. And what I'm going to suggest to teachers is that one needs to be reasonable here. One never reads anything. You don't listen to a seminar like this without your background knowledge. And some of you have very different levels of background knowledge related to this topic, and you also have very different purposes. One of the things that the Common Core, I believe, is inviting us to do is to correct for our tendencies to, at some point, make it so much about kids' existing knowledge and about spending an inordinate amount of time on setting purpose. Okay, so we, quote, attempt to motivate students, and we do all kinds of things to set purpose. I kind of have a rule of thumb that says that if the purpose setting or the generation of existing knowledge takes far longer than the reading, then it's not appropriate. That doesn't mean that there can't be discussion afterwards. I'm just talking about the pre-reading. We don't need to tell our students what the outcome is. We don't need to guide them through the entire text before they've read it. But we do need to give them a good sense of why and how what they're reading fits into this bigger picture, into the purposes, and into the knowledge bases that we're developing. Let me give you an example of one of the texts that's called out in the Appendix B of the Common Core, the Gettysburg Address. And there are a number of historical speeches and also documents within the documents that the Common Core writers gave us as potential examples. That is by no stretch a curriculum. They're given there as examples. But let's consider the Gettysburg Address, a very short document that's been very critical and remains critical to Americans and their definition of who they are and of their beliefs. What I'm going to suggest is that simply giving the document to students may be very difficult for students who don't have a vast array of experiences. But I'm not suggesting that we have to spend days and days developing the background for the Gettysburg Address. In the presentation that you'll get, I have additional materials that you can delve into on each of these examples. But what I'm suggesting is 5 minutes talking about memorials, or 5 minutes talking about the purposes of speeches, or in fact talking about Gettysburg very briefly can set a context for students and give them a purpose for reading. They can see it as an incredibly critical document that follows a whole tradition of speeches. And often in our classrooms, we haven't been looking at what's the function of one particular rhetorical device like a speech rather than another one, for example, like a debate or even a written script. So I've just gone through and just found things that I believe could be invitations and contextual, in a sense, some nodes or some hooks for students. And these don't have to overpower or take the place of the actual reading, although I'm always looking for additional information that students can read. So I'm just saying that if I actually had them do some of the reading on other speeches, or having them do some reading on Gettysburg, I would see that as a good opportunity, a good experience as well. We don't want to spend all of our time as teachers telling them and then having them just do very short and very cursory kinds of reading. So here's some examples. There are some absolutely outstanding information on memorials on a website related to Ground Zero, to the memorial at Ground Zero. There's additional information in the slides that you're going to get after the presentation. But each of these units could be something that would provide additional reading and potentially additional background. There's some fantastic speeches, like the script of J.K. Rowling's speech at the Harvard commencement. Is just a very excellent example of the genre. It's a different kind of example than a memorial speech, but it gives you a hook that students might actually be able to understand how the functions of speeches and the kind of language people use in speeches differs from other kinds of texts. And then there's also some background on the Gettysburg battle, which was the deadliest battle of the deadliest war in American history. And again, if you want students to do some additional reading, and I'm always looking for ways in which we can make connections through text. There's some excellent sources, and I've actually given some of them to you in the expanded version of the presentation. Okay, so what I'm talking about, what I'm really emphasizing in my first 4 points here today is a consciousness in our teaching and a consciousness among students as to what it is that we're learning and how I'm going to retain this knowledge. I also think when I was talking about the information nets, the information maps, that we want to keep returning to those. We want to ask, how does your information map now look differently now that we've learned this additional information? But for classroom teachers, I think an absolutely critical aspect of knowledge development is for us to support American students in seeing what it is that they can learn and become expert with through text. I think until students really develop an area of passion, something that they're truly excited about, we are going to struggle with the notion of complex text. If you haven't read a lot, it's going to be difficult to grapple with new text. And if you don't have an area where you read widely and deeply, it becomes very, very difficult to become a reader of complex text that is a contributor in the college and career-ready environment. I'm just amazed and so thankful that I've gotten to live in this age where we have this world's library open to us 24/7. And I look to see ways we can really invite our students. I live in Northern California, about a half hour from Silicon Valley. In fact, a lot of my neighbors work in Silicon Valley, and in a sense, this is one of the bedroom communities for Silicon Valley. And I think about what they do across the hill, which is what we call Silicon Valley across the hill. There's a little mountain range between Santa Cruz and Silicon Valley. But Silicon Valley has been a catalyst, not the only place, but a catalyst for the world in amassing and organizing knowledge. And there are so many kids, even in the 50-mile radius around Silicon Valley, who aren't going to have the proficiencies to participate in that largesse. In my community, when kids whose parents are involved in this knowledge organization, when they indicate an interest in something, they're encouraged to pursue that interest. They're encouraged to have books. If one of my neighbor friends is interested in otters, there's a visit to an aquarium. Another friend is interested in Lego, in designing these engineered, very, very complex forms, machines, buildings, whatever. And he actually has a portfolio of all those, and he studies engineering, and he has books like how things are made. Another one of my friends is very interested in organic gardening, and there are opportunities for that, to grow a tree, to grow a little vegetable garden, and there's a lot of reading around that. And I'm suggesting that within the topics, and I know this becomes more challenging as we move through the grade levels, but within topics, I'm suggesting that we need to give kids some leeway in which they develop an area of expertise, where they start becoming an expert and they start seeing the power of literacy within that topic. American students, despite what's often said in the newspaper, are not at the bottom of the national ranks in terms of their reading performances. They're not exactly at the top, but they're not doing as poorly as they're often described as doing. But one area where they are at the bottom of the ratings in international comparisons is in their interest in reading. And to me, I find that incredibly sad news, because here we are, the people that have the capability to amass this enormous amount of information in wonderfully accessible forms, and a lot of our kids aren't getting into that information. So what I've proposed is something that I'm calling a Funds of Information initiative. I'm actually suggesting that in schools we need to, and I see that in content areas in a middle school or high school, we might give a whole bunch of aspects of a topic and different titles that kids could read. These are some titles that I've accumulated for third grade, and they're just my suggestions. As you see, there are also some having to do with sports and fashion. It's not just highbrow literature, but it's things that interest kids and also give them a sense of what's available through text. What I'm actually suggesting is an initiative where we ask students to read across, you read one text from each of these areas, and then you either choose one of these areas or an area of your choice to actually get good at, and that you become known as the expert on whatever the topic is. For example, I'm an expert on California missions, and I've just been visiting some of the California missions on the Central Coast, and I could regale you with information about this. It's the passion individuals have for information that has them getting more and more information. There's a statement that is basically knowledge begets knowledge, and that's what we want for our students. Okay, the fourth, and I promise that I'm going to go through these last four a little bit more quickly, and then we'll have some time for questions. But the fourth one also has to do with knowledge, but this one is actually how we help kids get labels for new ideas or get new labels for old ideas. So very briefly, this is how text works. About 90% of the words, this may sound like an amazing thing to you if you've never heard this before, but 90% of all the vocabulary you typically read as an adult and is in the textbooks or novels or magazines or whatever you have in your classrooms comes from a shared core vocabulary that's made up of 4,000 simple word families. And by a simple word family, I mean like words like help, helping, helped, but not helpless and helpful, or locate, but not location. Okay, so stories and informational text share that core vocabulary. And if you want to see it, the list is actually on my website. Please don't send those lists home with kids. I know that you wouldn't, but I'm just suggesting that they're there for you to understand the vocabulary, not for kids to memorize. They're actually pretty complex words, a lot of them, even though they might seem simple, because like a word like help can be used as a verb and a noun and so on. Lots of different uses and also lots of idiomatic uses. But the point that I want to make here is that the text in content areas and the text of stories each have about 10% unique vocabulary. Now, the words in the center might be used differently, common words like a word like force or wind might be used differently in narrative or informational text. But the 10%, the words that actually make these texts unique, are very, very different from one another. And we need to give students an understanding of these differences when they're dealing with informational text and content areas and also narrative text. So let me give you an illustration. Always think of this. You don't ever teach a word individually by itself. Words mean something in relation to other words, and they cluster in different ways in informational and narrative text. So in narrative text, words hang out in meaning similar clusters, like tired, exhausted. And in informational text, words hang out in categories where the words aren't synonyms, but they depend on each other for their meanings. So quickly, here's an example of a topic in chemistry, designing mixtures, where you have some key nodes, dissolved substance and property, and then you have words that are linked to that key word. They aren't synonyms. But as you learn about odors and textures, you learn more about properties. Now, to give you some help with this, we've actually put together a set of slides that can aid you with some words, and this is really, really an important thing to do with English language learners. But keep remembering that the words in informational topics, these words cluster together, and as I learn more about natural energy or land or minerals, I learn more about natural resources, or I learn more about resources that aren't sustainable. Okay? Now, the words in stories are very different, and I'm just saying, for those of you who have an English language arts program that we think does a lot of the vocabulary instruction, we need to make distinctions in these kinds of vocabularies to give kids grist for the thousands of potential words that they might find in text. Now, the words in stories are a little different. On the left-hand side of your slide, amazed, fascinated, marveled, those are words that an author took in a particular text to communicate a certain idea. Now, none of these words, unlike the words here in the informational text, some of these are new concepts for students. In stories, most kids have an idea about being confused or clueless, or being scared or timid or nervous in front of other people. What they don't have are the distinctions and why this author chose to use these words rather than, for example, dumbfounded. Okay? What would it have meant if that author had used another word? Why do you think the author used the word bewildered rather than perplexed? Do they mean exactly the same thing? What I'm suggesting is that the words of stories relate to already known concepts, but they're new forms of those words. And good writers, if you think of somebody like Jane Austen, they use tons and tons of these kinds of words. A good writer doesn't keep repeating the same word over and over again. If you remember, some of you, like me, learned to read with Dick and Jane, who suffered from obsessive-compulsive behavior, and they always repeated the same word over and over and over again. They ran. Good writers don't do that. That's why that wasn't really great literature. It wasn't great literature. A good writer keeps nuancing. They keep painting the picture, and I'm saying that this is a critical notion that we need to communicate. We've provided some lessons at Text Project that you might want to take a look at that can help you in everyday kinds of lessons to start communicating this idea of the richness of different words that are commonly used, like a word like talk. Okay, those are the kinds of words we use in stories. Okay, now, fifth point. Bottom line is that most American kids don't read enough in school to get very good at it. For those of you in the upper grades, you weren't as influenced by No Child Left Behind in terms of some of the mandates, but we actually saw reading instruction increase, and we saw time spent reading increase very, very minimally. So it turns out that students, we can have all these initiatives to read more at home, but most human beings don't go home in the evenings and do things that they're not good at in their day jobs. And one of the ways in which we can actually increase that gap for the below basic students is by giving them less and less and less to read. Now, it turns out American students, by the end of second grade, most of them can recognize words at the level that they need for reading the kinds of texts we give them. They just aren't very fast at it. And by the longer we withhold additional reading, the slower they get. In one really critical study, a very large-scale study, they looked at the 7 classrooms that were more successful than 7 of the classrooms that were the least successful. And they found that the difference actually was in 7 minutes of reading that distinguished those classrooms. Remember my data at the beginning of the number of rare words? Well, if you're reading at about 127 words a minute, you read 7 minutes more. Look at how many more new words you'd actually encounter in text. That's the notion that I'm talking about in terms of students needing to read. Lots of students are not going to applaud you when you ask them to do some of the reading on their own. We're going to need to chunk some of that reading up. I think one of the things to do is to have them keep some track of what it is that they're reading. This is an example of a form. And the sixth point is we've really got to work on the stamina of their reading. And by that I mean we need to think about how much they're reading at any one stretch. I'm going to show you two sets of data quickly. This study came from a question my colleague Bob Pekelfi and I had about why students in our state were doing so much more poorly on the national assessment than they were on the state assessment, even though the state assessment was actually, as you see in grade 8, in terms of the lexile, it was a little bit more difficult in grade 8, and certainly in grade 4, fairly similar. There was a huge difference in the number of words that kids were asked to read on these two assessments. On the state assessment, students were reading maybe 375 words at 4th grade, getting to answer some questions. In the national assessment, they needed to read about twice that much before they were actually able to answer some questions and get some credit. I actually put this out here, that the ability of kids to sustain their reading is one of the most challenging issues we face. And I'm going to suggest that this needs to be very carefully orchestrated in your classrooms, increasing the amounts, the expectations, and so on that they're reading. Finally, I'm going to suggest, and I know a lot of you are in the upper grades, but I think this works at any grade. And I'm actually suggesting that rather than just a list of exemplars that was given in Appendix B of the Common Core, in schools and grade level teams, we actually have to call out what kinds of books we're expecting our kids, or what kinds of texts we're expecting our kids to read at different levels. And I think exemplars aren't to be taught in the curriculum. They're to exemplify to the students, to teachers at different grade levels, and to parents in the community what our expectations are. I'm really encouraging people to say, you know, we're growing your capacity. Yes, you have a hard time reading this many words at this point in time, but by the end of the year, this is the kind of text, this is the kind of task you're going to be able to do. So these 7 actions are written up in an article called 7 Actions, obviously, in a series called Text Matters. And all of this material is available. Everything that I've talked about today is available at textproject.org. We've also got some professional development units on how to learn about text complexity. I know that I've gone through these things quickly. I've attempted to cover a lot of ground to show you that it isn't about rushing out and saying we've got to have harder, different. What I'm saying is we've got to look at what our kids are learning. We've got to provide disciplined ways of supporting vocabulary, and we also need to increase massively the amounts our students are reading, and also the amounts that they're reading in any one session, their stamina, the length of time that they're reading. So thank you very much. I think we have some questions. So Molly and Nicole, do you want to? I think we've got about 5 minutes.
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Hiebert, for really a fabulous presentation. And we're going to go ahead and jump into Q&A in just a second. But I did want to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded and that you'll all receive a copy of this recording along with a certificate of participation and a copy of the presentation slides in just a few days. So you'll be able to reference all of this material as well. And so at this time, Nicole, I'm going to go ahead and pass things over to you to ask some of the questions for our Q&A session. Great, thank you, Molly, and thank you, Dr. Hiebert. We have a couple of questions here. So the first one we have is coming from Kay, and here's the question. Differentiation requires that we meet students where they are, and that often means using reading material that is on a much lower lexile level than what would be expected for students of that chronological age or grade. How would you address this, Dr. Hiebert?
This is a pretty complex question about, especially with kindergarten, and I've asked lots of questions about the degree to which we're pushing down. Let me just make some generic, let me just talk about lexiles or readability, quantitative readability formulas overall, and then I'm going to give a recommendation to this person for something to read. Okay, so I've in fact, Nicole, if we have that person's email, I'd like to send them some things, or we can put some things out on the web. But the readability formulas are at best general indicators that you can use to sort text. The level of precision in readability formulas is influenced greatly by the text type. So almost uniformly, readability formulas will give you a lower indication of a story because if sentences are short. The readability formula is impacted by that greatly. And in informational text, if a hard word like photosynthesis gets repeated over and over again, that text is going to seem much more difficult. It's going to get a higher rating. What I recommend to people, and this is something I spent the first 2 years after the Common Core made the recommendation to use certain a staircase of text complexity based on quantitative measures. I've raised lots and lots of questions about over-reliance. Keep remembering those are indicators. They can be very variable, and especially with younger students, we should be very cautious in how we're applying particular levels. I mean, if you remember in the Common Core, they actually didn't start giving any recommendations till 2nd grade. And that was something that I highly applauded. In fact, in the advisory committee that I was part of, that was our strong, strong recommendation. So there are lots of things on the website that you can look at in relation to readability formulas and specifically in relation to kindergarten. I've looked at that specifically, and also at 1st and 2nd grade.
Okay, great, Dr. Hiebert. I'll make sure that you get that email address.
Okay.
Here's our next question. We have time for just one more. This comes from Melissa, and she's asking, with the vocabulary web that you showed, would it be better to have the class create one web together or each child one on their own? I'm thinking about the lower functioning children who may not want to participate but who need the connectivity.
That's a good question. In showing that vocabulary web for informational vocabulary, I wasn't suggesting necessarily that, you know, you have to use it exactly like that, but I think it can be useful as an activity where students keep adding on. One of the things that you might do in a classroom is actually give students the existing nodes, right, if they're each individually doing it, and then they can keep adding words. So for students who aren't quite as facile with a topic, they might be able to have some flexibility. I mean, if the properties, substance, whatever, if those words are already there, that might be one way to scaffold it. I think that's a really good example of appropriate scaffolding. And I do want to say, especially with that question about readability, the Common Core, I think that the attention to attending to our kids' capacity with text is fantastic. It's raised numerous issues. Some of those issues are new for people. Some of them have been new for the teacher teacher education and research community, and I think people should go very cautiously, use common sense, but be committed. Things that I was trying to point out today is be committed to kids learning something. Be committed to knowledge. What is it that you're learning? That's what we're trying to do with this effort. What is it that we're learning? Keep the focus on what we've learned, and not be misdirected, or not be intimidated by some of the potential features. As I said at the beginning, text complexity is, in a simple term, complex. It's a complex issue. Thanks so much for all of your time. I feel very honored, and I feel very privileged. I hope that I didn't muddy the waters. In fact, have given you something concrete to work on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Dr. Hiebert, for a great Q&A. And just before we close, Dr. Hiebert, do you have any last comments that you'd like to share with the participants today?
Well, I think that was my closing comment. As I was saying, there are, we could have a course on this. In fact, I've developed that a set of 5 modules for people to use in staff development. And with all the material there, all the examples of the text, everything's there, all the exercises to do. We're going to have a lot to learn. I think my recommendation over the next couple of years is stay the course. I'm more sanguine now that I've seen the examples that Smarter Balanced put out. I think they're eminently fair, and I think our kids should be able to do those kinds of tasks that they're asking. But I think what we have to do is keep focusing on they need to be learning things and excited about learning. And I hope we can be excited about learning about the Common Core and text complexity over the next few years.
Excellent. Well, great. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. Our participants will be directed to a survey at the close of the webinar, and we certainly appreciate your feedback. And I would like to extend another great big thank you to you, Dr. Freddy Hiebert, for providing such an informative and really insightful presentation today. So thank you so much, Dr. Hiebert.
Thank you, everyone.
I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, and this concludes today's webinar. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.